Imagine a man who paints angels in the morning and attacks someone at night, who receives commissions from the Catholic Church while having an active arrest warrant, who puts the face of a fugitive on a sacred canvas. And that fugitive is himself. This man existed. His name was Caravaggio, and the art world was never the same after him. Milan, 1571, a city that smelled of gunpowder and disease, a city where death didn't knock before entering. This was the world where Michelangelo Merisi was born, the boy the world would come to know as Caravaggio, named after the small Lombard town where his family had roots. He was 5 years old when the plague arrived. 5 years old. The age when most children still believe the world is a safe place. Within days, he lost his father, his grandfather, his uncle. 3 pillars of the family swept away by the same disease in the same week. His mother survived, but something in that boy left with them. Think about that for a moment. What happens to a child who learns so early that everything can disappear? That life makes no deals? That death doesn't choose its moment? They grow up, but they grow up carrying a wound no one can see. At 13, he was sent as an apprentice to the workshop of painter Simone Pederzano. 4 years learning technique, composition, the behavior of light across different surfaces. But Milan no longer contained him. Rome was calling. In Rome, the young Michelangelo Merisi arrived with no money, no protection, no name. He slept in places no biographer has detailed with clarity. He went hungry. He worked for lesser painters, executing details that others signed. But he watched. He absorbed. He stored everything. And it was during this period that St. Francis of Assisi, in ecstasy, was born. Look at that canvas carefully. There is no golden glory, no crowd of celebrating angels. There is a man in the arms of a winged figure in an almost disturbing silence. The light doesn't come from heaven. It simply exists, cold, delicate. It was the first time Caravaggio placed on canvas what he carried inside: human fragility before the inexplicable. A man who yields, who surrenders, who doesn't fight, perhaps because he himself knew what it meant to be brought down by life. Soon after came the card sharps, and here something shifts. The scene is mundane. 3 figures at a gaming table, an innocent young man, a cheater hiding cards behind his back, an accomplice spying and signaling. Rome was exactly this. The streets where Caravaggio lived were exactly this. Betrayal, innocence, and greed sharing the same table under the same light. He didn't invent that scene. He lived it. And it was precisely this canvas that caught the attention of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, a powerful, cultured man, passionate about art. He saw the card sharps and recognized something the others couldn't yet name. He took Caravaggio to live in his palace, gave him stability, protection, and commissions. It was the first moment in Caravaggio's life when the ground felt solid, and it was on that solid ground that the rest on the flight into Egypt was born. An old and exhausted Joseph, holding sheet music for an angel playing violin, Mary sleeping with the child in her arms. The tenderness present there is almost surprising, coming from a man who grew up surrounded by loss. As if for the first time he allowed himself to paint something gentle, something that could breathe. Shortly after came The Lute Player, a young man immersed in music, in a light that seems to come from a single, invisible source. Focused, present, oblivious to the world outside. Some historians believe this young man was someone close to Caravaggio, a face he knew, a face that mattered. And here begins something that would repeat itself throughout his entire body of work. Caravaggio didn't use real models by chance. He painted people who were part of his life, friends, rivals, himself. The canvases were not merely art, they were confessions. Rome at the end of the 16th century was a city of violent contrasts. On one side, churches being built, generous commissions, powerful patrons competing for the finest artists. On the other, dangerous streets, rivalries that ended in confrontation, an everyday violence that was as much a part of the landscape as the fountains and ancient ruins. Caravaggio inhabited both worlds simultaneously. By day, he painted for cardinals and nobles. By night, he frequented taverns, gambled, fought, disappeared for days. He was known as much for his extraordinary talent as for his unpredictable temperament. Court records of the time show his name linked to numerous incidents, carrying weapons without a license, street confrontations, public offenses. It was as if two men lived inside him who could never make peace with each other. And it is precisely this internal conflict that begins to surface in the canvases of that era. Mary Magdalene in ecstasy. Look at this work. There is no performative sainthood, no calculated pose. There is a woman with her head thrown back, eyes closed, hands crossed over her chest, completely surrendered to something she cannot control. The expression on her face sits at the edge between pain and relief, between collapse and peace. Caravaggio knew that place, that exact place between destruction and surrender. Soon after came the portrait of Maffeo Barberini, The man portrayed would become Pope Urban VIII years later. But here he appears as he is, human, thoughtful, with flowers beside him and an open book in front. Caravaggio had this unsettling gift of looking at figures of power and seeing only the man behind the title, and painting that man with a honesty few dared. It was also during this period that he painted the portrait of a courtesan, a common woman, well-dressed, but without the artificial aura of religious figures of the time. She looks directly at whoever is watching, without shame, without supplication, with a quiet dignity that unsettled Caravaggio's contemporaries. Who was this woman? No one knows for certain, but some say she was someone he knew well, someone who was part of that nocturnal world he inhabited as much as the palaces of the cardinals. And then came Narcissus, one of the most enigmatic works in his entire production. A young man leaning over his own reflection in the water, completely absorbed, completely lost in himself. The composition is a perfect circle. The real young man and his reflection form a wholeness that needs nothing beyond itself. Some see in this canvas a critique, a warning, a veiled portrait of something Caravaggio recognized in himself. That tendency to look inward with such intensity that the outside world disappears. Or perhaps it is simply a young man before a reflection. Sometimes the work knows more than the artist who created it. It was also during this period that he received an unusual commission. Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. Not on canvas, on a ceiling, a mural for the garden of Cardinal del Monte, the three gods of the classical universe commanding space, sea, and the underworld. Caravaggio, who was never a fresco painter, faced the challenge with that unique combination of arrogance and genius that defined him. The result is disturbing and magnificent at once. Figures seen from below, with a perspective that anticipates centuries of visual experimentation. A work few have seen, few know, but one that shows that when Caravaggio was challenged, he did not retreat. He advanced, always advanced, until the day that advancing too far cost him everything he had built. There is a moment in some men's lives when everything converges. The talent, the recognition, the opportunities, as if the universe finally aligns what should always have been together. Caravaggio lived that moment between 1599 and 1601. The Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, in the heart of Rome, commissioned three monumental paintings about the life of Saint Matthew. It was the commission of dreams, one of the most important churches in the city, a space where his work would be seen by thousands, an invitation to eternity. And Caravaggio delivered something no one expected. The Calling of St. Matthew. Look at this canvas. A tax collector in a dark tavern. Men around him counting coins. And then a beam of light cuts through the scene, not from a visible source. It simply appears, the way grace appears, without warning, without asking permission. The finger extended toward Matthew carries an almost unbearable weight. Who is being called? The vain young man in the center, the old man hunched over the coins? Matthew pointing at himself as if he cannot believe it? The ambiguity is intentional, because grace rarely chooses who we expect. Right beside it, the inspiration of St. Matthew. The evangelist does not appear in celestial ecstasy. He appears as a common man, almost illiterate, with an angel guiding his hand as one would guide a child's. Dirty feet, an awkward posture. The first version of this work was rejected by the church. Too realistic, too human, too unsettling. Caravaggio repainted it, but he did not back down. It was also during this period that he painted Judith beheading Holofernes. And here, something different emerges. Violence enters the canvas directly, without metaphor, without veil. Judith holds the general's head with an expression that is not triumph. It is contained determination, almost discomfort, as if she does what must be done without pleasure, without glory. Behind her, an elderly maidservant watches with a coldness that chills. This canvas says something about Caravaggio that no biographer has fully explained. He understood violence, not as spectacle, as consequence, as something that leaves a mark on the one who acts as much as on the one who receives. And then came David and Goliath, the first version. A young David standing over the defeated giant's body. No celebration, no heroic pose. Only the silent weight of someone who has just done something irreversible. Irreversible. That word would define what happened in May of 1606. An argument, a tennis match, according to some records, a dispute over money, according to others. The man's name was Ranuccio Tomassoni, and the confrontation that followed ended with Tomassoni dead. Caravaggio fled Rome that same night. He left behind the palaces, the cardinals, the commissions, the reputation built over years of work and genius, everything. The sentence that followed was the most severe the Roman judicial system could issue. Bando capitale. Anyone could take his life without legal consequence. He was a man without protection in a city he himself had conquered. And the most disturbing part of all, he kept painting, fleeing, hunted, with no fixed address, no guaranteed patron. Naples, Malta, Sicily, each city a canvas, each canvas a confession from a man who knew time was running out and that the only way to exist was to create. The supper at Emmaus, painted in this period, is completely different from the earlier version, where before there was drama and expansive gestures, now there is restraint, shadow, silence, as if Caravaggio himself had learned that grand gestures come at a high cost, and that sometimes what remains is simply to sit at the table and recognize what has been lost. There is something that happens to a man when he loses everything at once, not gradually, all at once. The address, the name, the protection, the city that knew him. Caravaggio woke up in Naples as a fugitive, with his talent intact and his life suspended. Naples in 1606 was one of the largest cities in Europe, loud, chaotic, indifferent, the kind of place where a man could disappear without anyone asking questions. And that was exactly what Caravaggio needed. But disappearing was not something he knew how to do, because wherever he arrived, he painted. And when he painted, it was impossible not to be recognized. In Naples, he received commissions quickly. His reputation had arrived before him. And it was there that the taking of Christ gained a new dimension in his vision. That canvas painted years before in Rome, where Christ is surrounded by soldiers in the darkness of the garden, where Judas betrays him with a gesture that seems almost gentle, where a man in the right corner raises a lantern, illuminating the scene as if he were the painter himself, observing the betrayal up close. That man with the lantern. Many historians believe it is a self-portrait, Caravaggio placing himself inside the scene, not as hero, not as faithful disciple, as observer. As silent witness to a betrayal he understood very well, because he too had been betrayed, and he too had betrayed. From Naples he went to Malta, and in Malta something happened that none of his biographers expected. He was accepted into the Order of St. John, the most prestigious military and religious order of the time. He received the title of Knight. Grand Master Alof de Vignacourt, impressed by his talent, became his protector and his model. The portrait of Alof de Vignacourt and his page is one of Caravaggio's most formally impressive works. The Grand Master in full armor, imposing, with a young page beside him holding his helmet. It is a portrait of power, of hierarchy, of order. Everything Caravaggio never managed to maintain in his own life. There is a silent irony in this canvas that is impossible to ignore. The man who painted saints with dirty feet and courtesans with dignity now portrayed institutional power with all the technical precision he possessed, as if he knew he needed this man. That Vignacourt's protection was the only solid ground that remained. But the ground never stayed solid for long. Months after receiving the title of knight, Caravaggio became involved in yet another confrontation. The details are unclear. A disagreement with an officer of the order, a fight that ended with injuries, and imprisonment in a fortress in Malta. He escaped. No one knows exactly how, and fled to Sicily. It was in Sicily, in a flight that seemed to have no end, that he painted Ecce Homo, Christ presented to the people, crowned with thorns, humiliated, exposed. The expression on Christ's face in this canvas is not one of glorious martyrdom. It is exhaustion. Someone who has reached the limit of what a body and a soul can endure. Caravaggio had reached that limit too. And it was also during this dark period that the supposed self-portrait emerged. A male face rising from the darkness, eyes carrying something too heavy to be named. The brushwork is fast, almost urgent, as if he needed to see himself, to confirm that he still existed, that he was still someone. And then, in a gesture that reveals everything about who he was, he painted a second version of David and Goliath. But this time, something had changed irreversibly. The face of the beheaded Goliath. The face of the defeated man. Of the destroyed man. It was his own face. Caravaggio placed his own face on the head of the defeated. In the hands of a young David who looks down without triumph, without joy, with something that closely resembles pity. It was a public confession, a silent petition, a way of saying to the world, and perhaps to the Pope who had the power to pardon him, that he knew what he had done, that he carried that weight, that he was the fallen giant, not the hero, never the hero. There is a particular cruelty in the fate of some men, not the cruelty of sudden tragedy, but the slow cruelty of watching salvation approach, of almost touching forgiveness with the tips of your fingers, and then losing everything at the last moment. Caravaggio lived exactly that. After Sicily, he returned to Naples. It was 1609. 3 years of flight. 3 years sleeping with one eye open. 3 years painting as if each canvas might be the last. And in Naples, the news he had been waiting for began to take shape. Pope Urban VIII, the same Maffeo Barberini, whom Caravaggio had portrayed years before with a disarming honesty, was considering a pardon. The papal indult that would nullify the sentence, that would return to Caravaggio the right to go back to Rome, to have a name, to exist legally in a world that had decreed he had no right to exist. It was almost real. And then, one night in Naples, hooded men attacked him at the door of a tavern. The reason was never fully clarified. Old rivals, enemies made during the years of flight, or perhaps simply the random violence of a city that owed no one any favors. Caravaggio survived, but he emerged from the confrontation with a disfigured face, with injuries that contemporaries described as severe. The news spread across Europe. Some came to believe he had died. He had not died. But something in him had broken differently this time. Even so, he painted. It was during this period between physical pain and the wait for pardon that he completed some of the densest works in his entire production. The inspiration of St. Matthew carried a different weight when he revisited it in his mind. That common evangelist, guided by an angel, writing words he didn't know were coming. There was something in that image that haunted him, the idea of being an instrument of something greater, of creating without fully understanding what was being created. Caravaggio understood that better than any contemporary. And then came the information that would shape his next steps. The pardon was close. A vessel carrying documents was on its way. He needed to meet that vessel. He needed to be in the right place at the right moment. He set sail northward, July 1610, the suffocating heat of the Mediterranean. A 38-year-old man with his face still marked by injuries, with works scattered across Naples, Malta, Sicily, and Rome, with a death sentence still active over his head, sailing toward the only future that still seemed possible. The boat stopped at Porto Ercole in Tuscany, and there, on a beach or in an inn, depending on which account you read, Caravaggio died. Fever, exhaustion, wounds that had never fully healed, a body that simply could not go on. The pardon arrived days later, days. There is a word that carries this weight in a way that is almost unbearable. Too late, it came too late. And what remained were the canvases, scattered across churches, palaces, and museums in Rome, Naples, Malta, Florence, Paris, Madrid. A man who lived 38 years and left a body of work that 4 centuries later still stops people in the middle of a museum corridor and makes them forget for a moment where they were going. Because there is something in those canvases that transcends technique, that transcends history, that speaks directly to something inside who. When Caravaggio died on that beach in Porto Ercole in July 1610, the art world did not stop. There was no solemn funeral, no speeches, no crowd of admirers paying tribute. There was a dead man in a small town, far from Rome, far from everything he had built, and the canvases he left behind. In the years that followed, something curious happened. Artists who had never known him personally began to paint differently. The light in their work changed. the shadows grew deeper. Figures stepped down from their idealized pedestals and placed their feet on the ground from which they came. The world had learned to see through Caravaggio's eyes, without noticing, without naming it, simply seeing differently. Historians call this phenomenon Caravaggism, a movement that spread across Europe like water seeping through stone. Slowly, inevitably. Artists in Holland, Spain, France, and Flanders absorbed that language of light and shadow and transformed it into something of their own. Rembrandt never visited Rome, never saw a Caravaggio work directly. But some argue that the way light functions in his paintings would be unthinkable without what Caravaggio had done first. Velázquez carries that echo too. Georges de la Tour took chiaroscuro to an almost mystical place. Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the few recognized women painters of that period, was directly influenced by him and painted her own version of Judith beheading Holofernes with an intensity that still provokes discomfort today. But Caravaggio's legacy goes beyond technique. He changed what art could say. Before him, there was a clear boundary between the sacred and the everyday, between the divine and the human, between what deserved to be represented on a canvas and what should remain outside. Caravaggio dismantled that boundary, not gently, irreversibly, when he used a courtesan as a model for the Virgin Mary, when he painted saints with dirty feet and calloused hands, when he showed a tax collector receiving divine grace in a dark tavern, when he placed his own face on the head of the defeated giant. He was saying something that art had rarely had the courage to say, that the sacred does not live only on altars, that grace does not choose the deserving, that redemption has no fixed address, and that beauty can exist precisely where we least expect to find it, in the shadows, in the taverns, in weathered faces, in trembling hands. Look at the portrait of Alof de Vignacourt and his page, a man of absolute power and a young boy at his side. The gleaming armor and the page's gaze, carrying something the painter never named but placed there with complete precision. A vulnerability, an awareness that power always has someone small holding up its base. Look at the supper at Emmaus. Two disciples recognizing Christ in an ordinary moment, at a common table, with simple food. The recognition does not happen in the temple. It does not happen in the crowd. It happens when the guard comes down, when exhaustion allows truth to enter. Look at Narcissus leaning over his own image, the perfect circle between the real and the reflection, the beauty and the trap of self-contemplation. A work with no sacred figure, no biblical narrative, that speaks more about the human condition than many monumental altarpieces. Caravaggio understood that art does not need to explain, it needs to reveal. And there is an enormous difference between the two. To explain is to give the answer. To reveal is to turn on a light in a dark room and let the eyes adjust on their own. 4 centuries later, people still stop before his canvases with that specific expression, not of technical admiration, of recognition, as if they see something they knew but didn't know they knew, as if the canvas knew who they were before they knew themselves. That is not technique. That is not art history. That is something far rarer. It is connection across time. It is a man dead 400 years ago, still managing to look directly into your eyes and say something true. Very few artists in the entire history of humanity have achieved that. Caravaggio achieved it. And the most unsettling part of all is that he probably never knew. Go back for a moment to that beach in Porto Ercole, July 1610. The suffocating heat of the Mediterranean, a 38-year-old man lying down, the body that finally gave up, the pardon documents arriving days later, as if fate wanted to make sure he knew, even though he could no longer hear, that a second chance had been waiting for him. That came too late. Think about what this man left behind in 38 years. He left no structured family, no fortune, no organized workshop full of disciples, no letters explaining what he was thinking when he mixed those paints at 3 in the morning in a rented room in Naples or Syracuse. He left light. He left shadow. He left canvases that 4 centuries later still make people stop in the middle of a museum corridor and forget for a moment where they were going. And that raises a question with no easy answer. What do we do with a man like this? Because Caravaggio was not simply a troubled artist. He was a man fractured from the inside. Some historians believe the early trauma of losing his father, grandfather, and uncle in the same week at 5 years old permanently shaped his explosive temperament. That the boy who learned too soon that everything disappears grew into a man who could never fully trust that anything would stay. Those who knew him described his personality as unstable and unpredictable. Court records confirm he drank heavily, that he was intensely jealous and proud, that he carried his ego like a weapon and used it just as carelessly. And some modern scholars go further. They suggest he may have suffered from a personality disorder, possibly aggravated by the lead present in the paints he used daily. Lead in excess causes neurological damage, affects impulse control, darkens moods, distorts perception. A man already fractured by grief, painting his way through life with the substance quietly working against his own mind. It would explain much and excuse nothing, because what is undeniable is the pattern. Caravaggio sabotaged his own achievements repeatedly. He fled precisely when he was at his peak. He provoked conflicts that served no purpose. He burned bridges with patrons who genuinely wanted to protect him. He turned stability into chaos, as if peace itself made him uncomfortable. That is not simply a violent temperament. That is a man at war with himself. And yet, with all of that, through all of that, he painted Saint Francis surrendered in the arms of an angel with a tenderness that breaks the heart. He portrayed divine grace with an honesty no painter before had dared. He placed saints with dirty feet and trembling hands on sacred canvases and made the church uncomfortable with its own faith. How do we hold both of those truths at the same time? Perhaps that is exactly where Caravaggio's deepest lesson lives. Not in the technique, not in the chiaroscuro, not in the revolution he provoked in art history, but in the fact that he never pretended to be anything else. In an era when religious art was built on idealization, on perfect figures, on a calculated distance between the human and the divine, Caravaggio insisted on showing the crack where light enters, where grace finds space, where the real and the sacred touch in a way no golden altar can reproduce. Judith holds the sword with trembling hands. David looks at the giant's head without celebrating. The Magdalene surrenders without knowing exactly to what. The tax collector points at himself as if he cannot believe the call could be meant for him. And Caravaggio places his own face on the head of the defeated. Not the hero, the defeated, a man who knew exactly what he had done, who carried that weight without hiding it, who transformed guilt, flight, and fear into a body of work the world has not yet fully surpassed. There is a form of courage in that which is rarely named. The courage not to absolve yourself, to look at your own reflection like Narcissus without romanticizing what you see, and still continue. Continue painting, continue revealing, continue placing light where there was only darkness, because in the end, that is what Caravaggio's canvases do. They don't comfort, they don't explain, they don't resolve, they illuminate. And when a light is strong enough, it travels 4 centuries without losing its intensity. You are seeing that light right now. It reached you. If this video moved something in you, leave a like and follow the channel. Tell me in the comments, which artist do you want us to explore together next? I'm here.